Hello, everyone, and welcome to Colonsay. It's such a pity that we're not gathered together in Athlone in Ireland. The SICAMM-Conferences are so valuable for meeting and sharing ideas, and this is a poor substitute. But nonetheless, I welcome you to Colonsay and to talk through the Colonsay Reserve, how I manage the bees, the forage for the bees, and my management system for a very isolated, close population, which I've had now for over 30 years on the West Coast. So here we are, this small island out on the west. Just for those who aren't familiar with Scotland and with beekeeping on Scotland, we have a mountain range down the west coast that greatly influences the climate, both in the west and also in the east. And it is in the east where most of Scottish agriculture and beekeeping is practiced. Out on the west, it is really too wet, too high rainfall, and it's only out on the lower remote low-lying islands where we have high sunshine levels that beekeeping is possible. I started on Colonsay to make a living from oysters, and that in the late 70s was how I started. I started my beekeeping by being introduced to a shed load of empty hives that had been, and this is the gentleman, Joseph Tinsley, who was the beekeeping officer for the West of Scotland College of Agriculture. And he, a man well ahead of his time, realized that black bees in Scotland were getting hybridized by imports. And so he was looking for somewhere isolated where he could improve, raise and improve stock and sell queens. And he was looking for an island. And here we can see he found Colonsay in the Inner Hebrides. He describes the island and the barren rocks, rugged, large areas of fertile land with rich pastures. It's interesting, the population were 200 inhabitants in the 1940s, 2,000 in past centuries, and now we're down to 100. So this gives an indication of some of the very hard rocky ground that covers a great deal of the island. And this gives a indication of the small farms, sheep and cattle in the fertile areas of Colonsay. In the middle of the island, there is this big estate house and planted out areas with trees and many exotic plants, trees, sycamore. We've even got eucalyptus. But wind is also and always an important factor. You see the effect of wind. Many would say that the black bee is almost a waste of time because you can't build up large populations large enough to commercially get a good crop of honey. I'd never found that. And as you can see here, The bees on Colonsay are not used to hot weather. We seldom get temperatures above 20 degrees. This is actually up at 25, 26, and the bees have found it impossible to keep things cool inside and have bearded out. But as you can see, it's a really good, strong population. And this is what we're aiming at, is to have this strength of population for the heather. And this is the big crop that we're trying to get at the end of the season. We're very lucky on Colonsay to have both ling and bell both together. The bell heather coming a week to 2 weeks earlier than the ling heather, but it spreads over up to about 6 weeks. And so you're almost guaranteed, not every year, but mostly you're guaranteed at least a week, 10 days of good weather in amongst that time to be able to pick up a crop. And here you can see the two heathers flowering together, both very different, one thixotrophic, the ling thixotrophic, the bell, a flower, honey, very difficult to extract when they're together in a comb. Very slow process extracting, but it's a wonderful honey, the end product, with both heathers together in the same jar. The honey is, the heather on Colonsay, as you've been able to see earlier, is on rock. So there's a definite terroir to the Colonsay honey. Most of the heather honey in Scotland and in Europe is all on heath, on bog. And very seldom do you get it all on rock. And that makes a huge difference and adds greatly to the flavour of Colonsay honey. Prone to drought, unfortunately. And just a point of note, bees definitely forage over water, and it's often you read in books, you need to be in the mountains for heather to yield. Not so. I would have to mention bracken. All over the West Coast, with the warmer winters that we're now getting, bracken is spreading and spreading very, very quickly. When I started to build my house here some 30, 40 years ago, there was no bracken here at all. It's hard to believe, but we used to pick wild strawberries along the front here, and now bracken is spreading and taking over very good heatherland. I will repeat it again. I think conservation and a sustainable business go together. Just a point of interest, I use wide-spaced combs, 8 combs to the super, and we're talking roughly about 16 kilos plus when you get a full super. So a couple of supers full of heather honey, very valuable. All the honey, incredibly, now I'm able to sell on the island. We have a lot of tourism. It's very high quality honey, and so has a very good reputation. And with the sales I have from this one cabinet here, and we do postage as well, I'm able to sell over a ton of honey. Pollen. We have a great mix of pollen on Colonsay, and I think the basis of my success is to the variety of pollen that the bees are able to get at any one time. And this healthy bees, very, very important. And I can't stress enough the importance. I think much of the problem with bee disease that we have is due to lack of pollen and single forage pollen. So the advantages of beekeeping on Colonsay: isolation, long season with several. We're not going to get them all, but now and again you get a good spell of weather and you get the honey crop. Referring to the pollen again, mild winters, and of course, disadvantages. The climate, we're right on the edge here to make a viable commercial go of it. And here is the key: it's the number of queen mating days. I find that many many virgin matings take place well below the 20 degrees that one is meant to expect for queen mating. 15, 16 is quite common, and I find that many virgins get mated not in drone congregation areas, but in around local apiaries, because we simply don't get the calm, still days, or many of them, for congregation areas to form. So colony numbers are limited on Colonsay. And of course, this affects inbreeding. The more colonies you can maintain, the less of a problem you have with inbreeding. So spring pollen, if we get a good spring, we can get off to a good start and build up those colonies. It's the difficult years where the colonies never get going that are the problem. And of course, we've got this inbreeding problem to take care of, and we'll talk about that shortly. So how are we going to manage a closed population? We want to select for improvement. We want to improve our stock, gentleness, productivity, disease, and we've also got to avoid inbreeding. So let's look at the problems associated with inbreeding. We've got to look at the size of the population, the variability that we started with. We've to look at the generation lengths, and we've to look at the selection pressure that we're going to put on that population that we brought into isolation. So early days, this was 1978, the old double-walled hives, excellent for beekeeping in this part of the world. But if you're running more than 20, labor is far too much. So I moved to the single-walled hives. And here we have oops, I have to go back. How do I do that? How do we go back? How do we go back? Help. Can anyone help?
Usually it's on the...
Yeah, usually just the up arrow. If you've got the arrows at the bottom. If you press down, you should go forwards. If you press up, you should go back.
Ah, no, okay, I have to go into that left-hand corner. Gotcha. Okay, sorry about that one. Right, so this gives an indication of where I got my bees in Scotland and the numbers of stocks that came out. I was greatly influenced by this man here, Bernard Mobus, a great black bee man. He was convinced that local bees were the best for Scotland, and he did a lot of breeding work. And up in, this is up here, little place called Maud, north of Aberdeen, and was very influential in the early days in Scotland, throughout Britain, for breeding local bees adapted to local conditions. He said to me, find native bees and bring them out to Colonsay. I knew nothing about the tinsley work apart from the empty hives. That's the interesting thing. It was Bernard who set me straight. So we have 30 queens in all coming out to Colonsay, and if we consider that each queen might be mated by 10 different drones, we have a potential of around 300 variants, 300 queen mothers coming out onto an isolated island. And that has been the stock that I've worked with for over 30 years. How did I select my bees? Well, of course, there was no DNA analysis at that time, and I was going simply on observation of hybridization. And here we can see bee here in a drone hybridized. And so these were the stocks I was not going to bring out onto Colonsay. I was fortunate. I worked with Athol Kirkwood on the east of Scotland. He was running about 1,500 hives, and I did 2 summers with him, and so went through literally thousands of hives on a daily basis. And your eye gets into different stock that were hybridized, stock that were much more pure. I got my eye in, and I, plus luck, selected well and ended up with a pretty pure stock of bees on Colonsay. Now we have to look at generation lengths, because this is an important one. Over 41 years, if we replace our queens annually, we end up with 41 generations. Goodness, when you think in the States, they're having to replace their queens almost twice a year. There's a huge difference between that and me replacing every 3 and 4 years. I find queens should last 3 to 4 years, have no Varroa, and with no disease, plenty of good pollen. Queens last as they would have done in the wild for 3 to 4 years. You cut down the problem of inbreeding considerably. And so that is regardless of the selection pressure you put on it. Simply by looking at generation lengths, we can improve things immensely. Now look at that selection pressure. How much are we going to put on our population? If we did nothing and just left them completely, if it was a wild population, it would be local climatic adaptation that would select. That would be the rider. If we do it from a very intensive breeding point of view, rapid improvement, but we're going to lose a lot of our variability that we took to that isolated area. Minimal is very slow improvement, but with stability. We're culling the worst and we're replacing everything else. So conserve and improve. That's the theory. And what improvement are we looking for? Productivity, obviously. Gentleness, very important, both from a point of view on Colonsay and also if we're selling stock off the island, if folks can get gentle stock, a great improvement. Swarming, I'll go into this question of swarming. It's one of the traits that you really can select against and move to a more natural non-swarminess supersedure stock of bees. Disease, as I say, not a problem. Chalk brood, mostly the one that worries me out on Colonsay. So how are we going to do this? Let's look at the thing in a practical point of view. We've got here, as I've said before, the younger stock, year-old and 2-year-olds, were building up into big, strong colonies to take on that heather. The older 3- and 4-year-olds, you'll see them. Every apiary is worked exactly the same way. And the older queens, we're wanting to replace so that we don't lose this line. And we're also wanting to have stock for sale and also to maybe replace, if we've got one that's too aggressive or not productive, we would want to replace that. How are we going to do it in a simple fashion? And that's the old tried, tested way, the Demery system. We simply move, build up our stock so that it's wanting to swarm, or is, if it's not a swarmy stock, it's certainly packed with bees. We then move the bees up, all the brood goes upstairs, queen downstairs in a new box. The old Demery system, we end up with many queen cells upstairs and we replace this stock and perhaps another one. Very simple, nothing complicated. And I want to talk about swarm survival because I think it's a very important trait of the black bee. Here we've got Sealy and also another set of not really, I suppose they were experiments in a way, but papers written. And of course, supersedure is a much better proposition if you are losing many of your swarms. It's biologically a very poor way of reproduction. I'm well aware, of course, that supersedure is not reproduction, but at least we're moving forward to a kinder year when swarming might be more beneficial. So I have found that I get a lot of stocks that end up with supersedure. Here we've got the mother was the red and the daughter in the white. I see this very often. And here in my home apiary, I have a stock, this stock here, that has superseded 6 times. So the last time I needed to do anything to this stock here was in 2004. Many will say that supersedure is no use. You end up with a very poor stock. The line in a way dies out. What you do need is luck to get the young virgin mated when the old queen, before she dies out. And I seem to have got that here every time. This year, this stock produced over 40 kilos of heather honey. So what beekeeping have I done for this stock? All I've done is really put on the supers, take off the supers. At swarming time, I will peep inside, split here, look inside to see how she's doing. Apart from that, if there are no swarm cells, leave it alone. And that, to me, is beekeeping. The least disturbance you need to do for your bees, the better. So let's look at inbreeding for the population. We're isolated, and of course, everyone points to the problems of inbreeding in isolated populations. Mostly, I don't come across this problem. I do, I build up, you've seen from the photos, I can build up good, strong colonies. And occasionally we'll see this short brood. This is actually more a queen, an older queen that's running out of semen. You can see the telltale signs of drone brood in amongst, but she's pretty short, this one, but it was just to illustrate the difference. I first got my DNA analysis done, Bovis Peterson, part of the BADE project in 2000. He looked at it and things looked pretty good at that time. Then a PhD student of Annette Brun-Jensen, who was working with Bovis Peterson, summer of 2010, she did a complete repeat of the Colonsay population and found that I'd lost nothing. So things were good. It's time I did it again. Hopefully, we've got some very good geneticists now at Roslin in Edinburgh. And hopefully I'm going to get another thorough analysis of all the stocks done, just to see from a genetic point of view how things are out on Colonsay. I now want to look at this question of the reserve. How did we get the legislation required to keep the population secure? And this is a very important one. Having over the decades built up a secure population, how was I going to keep it secure for the coming generations? And the story, interestingly, starts on another island and starts with SICAMM. The beekeeping web continues. So here I visited the island of Lesu, 2004. And just at that time, the severe problems that the black bees on the island were under, because the legislation that they thought they had was being broken. And there were others who thought that the Italian bee, or the cross black Italian, was much more productive. And the black bees that had been there for generations were seriously under threat, and the legislation that they thought they had wasn't proving adequate. And so I met this man, and I have the order wrong, but so I met Fleming. Well, I met Fleming because Lefroy introduced me to Fleming. Fleming, a very, very keen Lefroy man, and I hadn't happened to have a bottle of Lefroy with me. So we spent a lot of time over this bottle, but Fleming said to me, look, you've got a good population of black bees on Colonsay, you must look after it. And said to me, you really need to do something. You see what's happened here, try and get the legislation in place that will look after the population. So then I was in Ireland at Epimondia 2005, the following year, and in amongst the crowd of folks going round all the stands, there was Fleming again. And basically, he kicked my arse. He said to me, "What have you done since we last spoke a year ago?" And I said, "Nothing." And he was quite angry. He said to me, "You have to do something. Away you go and do it." And I did look at it, and it's really quite a difficult one, because under Scots law, the honeybee is both a domestic animal and when it's hived, but it is also a wild animal when it's in the wild. So here we have a domesticated animal, and here we have the same animal in the wild, but it's a wild animal. And so under legislation, it's neither one thing or the other. So I set off to see if I could find some existing legislation that would solve my problem. And under agricultural legislation, things are limited to disease and to trade. And the honeybee, as I say, is domesticated and wild, but under agricultural legislation, it isn't an agricultural animal. So I was really stuck as far as agricultural legislation, which seemed the obvious route to go down. I was completely stuck. And so I looked then at conservation legislation and tried there. But then I was told, well, you must prove that the black bee, Apis mellifera, is native to Scotland. And that wasn't an easy thing to do. And it was there that I got in touch with Norman Carrick, who was looking at the problem as well and brought out a paper that really drew together all the indications, the archaeological indications, etc., that proved that, yes, the honeybee is native to the UK. It isn't an introduced species. So that was a good step forward. But then, of course, they said, well, it might be native to Scotland, but it could possibly be native to an island that's 20 kilometers from the mainland. They had a point there. And then conservation legislation can't be used for domesticated animals. And also honeybees compete with true native pollinators, bumblebees, solitary bees. So things weren't looking good as far as conservation legislation was concerned. I wasn't getting anywhere. The years were passing, and I was almost giving up, actually. I'd spent a huge amount of time and effort trying to find the legislation, to convince bureaucrats and government ministers that this was a project worth doing. And then I was going to say got independence, but not quite. We got our devolved government in Scotland, and through that, we also got our devolved Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Bill that separates the environmental legislation away from the rest of the UK. And so that seemed an ideal opportunity for me to try and get legislation a separate piece of legislation that would apply to Colonsay and the black bees there. And for anyone else attempting this, I would seriously recommend that you find some minister, I beg your pardon, some member of parliament who understands wildlife legislation. And I was very lucky. I got the help of a Peter Peacock who'd done conservation legislation for other species before. He understood how to go about it. And again, fortunately, he was an opposition MSP. And I would recommend you find somebody in the opposition who will constantly badger the existing government. That was the Scottish Nationalist Party were in power, and he was a Labour MSP. And he worked extremely hard to get the legislation through. And we were able to do that. I had a great deal of help from Europe. I must stress that, from the different European organizations, from beekeeping organizations, from beekeeping professionals, who all put effort in to persuade the Scottish government that this was a project worth doing. And eventually, 2013, the order came through, and this protects the population of bees here from introduction of foreign genes. So effort, almost 10 years, but well worth the effort in the end. So having done that, I think it very important to try and disseminate as much as possible the genetic material that's existing out here to help improve Scottish beekeeping and those who want to maintain and improve the native honeybee of Scotland. I've said queen rearing, queen raising, particularly queen mating, very difficult in a difficult climate with few queen mating days. And I've found that raising a few cells at a time, so grafting and raising maybe 8 to 10 cells at a time, and having several queen cell raisers going at the same time is much more valuable than having a large cell raiser. It's very expensive in bees to raise queen cells, particularly when a lot of your virgins aren't going to get mated. So it's a bit like spread betting. You want small numbers regularly over a season. A lot of them will get wasted, but you get better results at the end of the day. And I'm able to sell off the island quite a number of nuclei and queens. Of course, mating, the smaller the mating hive, the better apidea, ideal for that. To get your queens, the bees will push the virgin out quickly when she's ready to go. I make up my apideas, this simple device. I bring my queen up into the box. She lays out in here, and then I make up my apideas from that. Or I split overwintered. Because of the mild climate, I'm able to overwinter queens and be able to sell them in the spring. And then I can split up that nuclei. And then at the back end, we've got the possibility of using these frames for heather. And this is a good for overwintering. And I bring all of these mini nukes together and overwinter them. And here the heather honey is valuable for overwintering. You'll note that they're on a constructed frame. And of course, this is to keep the rats away from the mini nukes. They just tear them apart. These ones will come off and go on the stand for looking after the hives over winter. And research. The importance of having controls has been very valuable. This is assistant Steve Martin's assistant. Done a lot of work on Varroa and just several of the research projects I won't go into, we haven't time for that. But I would mention this is an interesting one for Colonsay because we're not treating for Varroa. Braula Sique, the bee louse. What I find in the back end in autumn when the bees aren't feeding brood, the louse, the bee louse, then move to the queen because she's the one that's being fed and you can steal a meal from that. But the interest scientists have in the bee louse is that it is, of course, a fly that's lost its wings. It used to travel between colonies of bees in the wild to steal its meal, and basically found that if I could be carried by bees or by drones that constantly move between stocks, why on earth would I need wings? Oh, wrong, moved it forward, sorry. Why on earth would I need wings? And those that study the change in genetics of wing find this a fascinating animal to study. And I send a lot down to London each year to a man looking at things to do with bee louse there. We've maybe just got time to ask the question, what's Tom considering and thinking? I posed the question to him. How does a queen differentiate between a queen cup and a drone cell? I originally had contacted Professor Seeley regarding the work he was doing on scout bees. Everyone will probably be familiar with the work that Tom did regarding scout bees on Appledore Island off the coast of Maine, and the kind of seminal work he has done on scout bees. And I had, through the fact that I'm the only beekeeper on the island, and if bees are starting to get attracted into houses, I'm constantly being telephoned by individuals saying the bees are swarming. And I'd go and look and find a swarm, and would not find a swarm anywhere. And so I then started to get interested in scout bees and just how they operated. And here's an instance that I found really interesting, because I'd got a phone call. The girl who was cleaning the flats in the big house had been terrified to go into a bedroom to clean the beds because the bees were swarming into the room. And I was pretty convinced that, no, there couldn't possibly be a swarm. It's early, it's only May, too early for bees to be swarming on Colonsay. But nonetheless, I went and had a look to see if I could find the colony that might be in the process of swarming, because by that time I realized it wasn't swarming that was going on. These were the scout bees looking for a new home. And this was the stock that I could see, that I thought, yeah, this must be a likely culprit. So I looked inside, and sure enough, found the bees hanging in curtains, as they do before they want to swarm. And you can see the queen already. They've stopped feeding her, and she's getting thin, ready to fly. So I then went looking for queen cells and could find none. There were no queen cells. So what on earth were the scouts doing looking? They hadn't even swarmed, never mind started queen cells. Why were they looking for a new home? And I looked more carefully, and there I found here a cup with an egg laid in it. And so I did an artificial swarm, and immediately I did that, the scout bees stopped activity at the bedroom window, and the eggs disappeared from the cups. And so I immediately started thinking about this one. And it got me thinking, well, hang on, how did the queen know to lay a fertilized egg here and yet an unfertilized egg there? We're told its size. Is it to do with the way that the cell is hanging on the frame? Is it to do with the physicality of the cell? When I asked Tom Seeley the question, he said, and he thought long time about this, he said he thought probably pheromones. I'm not so sure, and I wonder if in fact it's not to do with the scout bees. Are they the ones that are moving the cells? We know that bees will move eggs around. And so I've been following this question of scout bees and the question of, are they involved much more than we think in the cell, the queen cell, the swarm cell development than we assume the queen to be. And here, just at my home, everyone has old equipment hanging about, and these bees are clearly scout bees. I mark them, and here we have, of course, it's very easy then to identify which ones are wanting to swarm. And of course, we can see quite clearly, yes, they are at that process of development. But my question, and I'm sure experiments could be set up with modern techniques and with the mini cameras that are available now to view inside hives, to look at what happens in queen cell development. What happens with queen cups? Who moves? Does the queen lay in there, or are the eggs actually deposited in there from other cells? Professor Seeley, when he was visiting Colonsay, was talking about his retirement and his garden and wood that he, in Appledore, that not in Appledore, forgotten the name, where he lives now, his retirement projects. But I would think maybe this would be a lovely one for him to continue on with. So, conservation and sustainability, I think, very, very important. I would like to think the project on Colonsay could sustain itself long into the future, the bees supporting the beekeeper and the beekeeper supporting the bees. Thank you very much. Thank you.